All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're doing great out there. Thank you all for watching. In this video, I'm going to talk about Robert Nozick's experience machine, the case, and then the argument that's supposed to be derived from it. Whoops. So there's Robert Nozick. I'm not going to say much biographically about him. He's um, known for the experience machine argument and quite a few other important arguments in philosophy. Um, but I really just want to focus on this one argument that he's famous for. As you see, he passed away in the very early 2000s. He spent a long time in his philosophy career teaching at Harvard University. But here's the thought experiment that he wants us to focus on. So hopefully you found the Nozick reading manageable. So imagine you could hook up to a supercomputer with the power to generate countless experiences of your choosing. Okay, so you just might imagine that technology has just become so advanced that we could do this, electrodes coming out of your brain connected to a supercomputer, and then, well, the the computer scientists or some AI program, right, is able to basically download virtual experiences. When thinking about that, like what experiences would you choose? You could choose any enjoyable experiences from a vast database of experiences. Select the most pleasant experiences for 2 to 5 years or for the rest of your lives, perhaps. Here's the only catch. The experiences, as I've noted, are virtual. That means is that they have no essential connection to reality. They are in a way simulated. Okay, so if you're um, in an experience machine, if you're in Nozick's experience machine, then you're basically in a simulation. Some of you may know that terminology from other contexts. So you have these experiences simulated, but you're not really doing the thing in question. It appears to you, though, that you are. So would you hook up? Would you want to hook up if such technology were available? Suppose, again, it's for a significant chunk of your life, if not your entire life. You could experience going to sporting events if you're choosing playoff games in Major League Baseball, UFC fights. You could go do something outdoorsy. You could climb Everest or some other famous peak. You could go to the beach, enjoy plenty of beach time. So, countless examples of, what could be created in this smorgasbord of experiences, virtual experiences. So here we distinguish between the virtual and the veridical. So I've said what I need to say about the virtual ones. I think we have a rough grasp of those. The veridical ones are the ones that have a connection or this necessary connection to reality. Okay, so when I'm experiencing, looking at this um, computer screen at the moment, that's a veridical experience, all things being equal, okay? Because it has an object in the world that I'm um, connected to by way of my sense experiences. Let's suppose that's true for argument's sake. Even if it's not true, we still can understand the conceptual difference between the virtual and the veridical, couldn't we? Okay, and that's all we really need. So Nozick, he develops the experience machine thought experiment, the experience machine case, to test theories of well-being. Remember, so well-being is part of a value theory, a theory of like what's good for us, what's intrinsically good for us. And Nozick's experience machine case, argument derived from it, is supposed to challenge theories which claim that it's experiences only, whether they're simulated or real, veridical, as we called it, that matter to well-being. Okay, so what Nozick wants to argue is that such theories are false. Okay, that something beyond just experiencing matters, And what's going to matter is some connection to the world as well. So what's a value theory? We've talked about this already, so this is just a bit of a quick review in case there are further questions on this. And very often when I teach value theory, when I teach normative theory or ideas as various parts of an ethical theory, it takes a little bit for students to get adjusted to understand what's going on. So this recapping is probably a good idea at this point. So we know value theory is a theory of intrinsic goodness and intrinsic badness. Okay. What's a theory of intrinsic goodness? It's something that it's a theory of what's intrinsically good. And what's intrinsic goodness? Well, it's something that doesn't derive its goodness from any external source, as we put it. It's good by its very nature. It's something that's good for its own sake. It's non-derivatively good. The goodness is internal to it, not external to it, that kind of thing. Okay. So remember, Socrates thought that virtue was intrinsically good. Aristotle thought that virtue and pleasure were intrinsically good. Epicurus thought that pleasure was intrinsically good. Okay. We've seen examples of this already. Okay. Some candidates for things that count as intrinsically good, at least in the philosophical tradition, and thinking about this question. And these are just candidates. So no one needs to hold this view, but these are candidates. Happiness, pleasure, desire, satisfaction, when you have your desire satisfied. Virtue, autonomy, friendship, knowledge, justice, these kinds of things. And then the opposites of these things would be intrinsically bad things. So unhappiness, displeasure, pain, desire, frustration, vice, um, 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 unfreedom, loneliness, ignorance, injustice. Okay. So of course, extrinsically good things are related to the intrinsically good things. The extrinsically good things get their goodness from the extrinsically good things. So so we know that these are things that aren't good in themselves. They're not good for their own sake. They're not non-derivatively good. They're derivatively good. Okay. And we know the classic examples: money, but of course there's also success and other such things. But the money case is easy to think about because almost everyone thinks that money would be an example of something that, if it's good, it's only extrinsically so, not good by its very nature. Okay. But when is money good? It's good when it brings about whatever is intrinsically good, or something that's intrinsically good. Okay. So that's derivative goodness, derivative. There's also a derivative badness. I think this slide here, whoops, let me escape out of here. That wasn't what I wanted here. Let me just click this. Goodness. Okay, so again, this is just on the theme of derivative goodness. So money, as we know, doesn't have any value in itself. Its value comes from something external to it. And then, money is good because it provides us with the resources that provide us with happiness. And that might be like where we stop and say, okay, what explains money's goodness is its relation to this thing, happiness. And someone like Epicurus would be happy with that answer. Okay. Someone like Socrates would say, no, you got to go even further, because what explains happiness is good is going to be virtue. So on the simple model, money gets its goodness ultimately from the happiness it is instrumental in bringing about. Okay, or the happiness, the happiness that money causes. Okay, so think about X being instrumental to Y, or money being instrumental to happiness. Is that some kind of causal relationship? Okay. So we already know this. Intrinsic goods are non-derivatively good. Extrinsic goods are derivative goods. And then conversely, we think about badness. Extrinsically bad things are the non-derivative bad things, and the extrinsic bads are the derivatively bad things. Okay. I'm going to skip this argument here. I want to do a little bit of taxonomy here so you can see the various kinds of theories that are out there in the literature. So there are a set of theories that we call monistic theories, meaning that they claim that there's but one thing that's intrinsically good. And so far we've seen two monistic theories, because we've seen Epicurus' hedonism, which maintains that one thing's intrinsically good. Conversely, one thing is intrinsically bad. And then Socrates, he said that virtue is the one thing that's intrinsically good, and thus vice would be that which is intrinsically bad. So those are monistic theories, theories that give us one thing to explain goodness and badness, as it turns out. Hedonism, we know what that is. Desire satisfactionism is monistic theory, because it claims that the one thing that explains something being good is that someone's desires are satisfied. Okay. A virtue theory would be a monistic theory. A virtue theory like the one developed by Socrates would be a monistic value theory. Here I'm just giving some common examples. Okay, but a virtue theory would be up there as well. And here's hedonism. We already know that view. We already know desire satisfaction theory. So having one's desire satisfied is what's intrinsically good. And of course, having one's desires frustrated is intrinsically bad. Now, another kind of way of characterizing a value theory is in terms of whether it's subjective or objective, whether it's subjectivist or objectivist. So hedonism, desire satisfactionism, they're typically classified as subjectivist theories of value. I say typically because there's some out there who disagree with that, or who develop what they consider to be an objective such theory. But let's say typically classified as subjectivist theories. So according to these theories, what counts as intrinsically good depends on the attitudes of the individual subject. That's why it's called subjectivism. Either what they take pleasure in, what they desire, and what they care about. So if you think about hedonism, desire, satisfaction, of course, different things can be unpleasant to different people, and people can have different sets of desires. According to at least common versions of hedonism, common versions of desire satisfaction theory, it doesn't matter what the pleasures are. So they can be vastly different across individuals. What matters is, for intrinsic goodness, is the fact that pleasures are experienced if you're a hedonist, and if your desires are satisfied if you're a desire satisfaction theorist. Yet whatever the desires happens to be. Important note, when we think about objectivist theories, these are theories that claim that what's intrinsically good, at least in part, doesn't depend on the attitudes of the individual subject. So monistic theories of value could be objectivist. So you can imagine thinking about virtue as being something that's objective. So there's something objective about what it means to be wise or courageous or just for example, okay? So that's something that Socrates would have thought, something Plato would have thought likely. So, so suppose you have a virtue theory like Socrates does, who is also a monist. So in virtue of being a monist, one isn't either subjectivist or objectivist, because you could be either. So this is what we mean when we say something like monism and the monism and the objectivist distinction. They kind of cut across each other. Okay. Now there's the monism about value, but then there's also pluralism about value, which is the contrast view, which maintains that at least more than one thing counts as intrinsically good. And the most common versions of those in the literature are what we call objectivist theories or perfectionist theories. So according to the objectivist theories, so the objective is going to give you a hint that we have something objective in the theory of what counts as good or intrinsically good. According to these theories, just to give you just a sense of how the theories work, there's more than one intrinsically good thing. Okay, because we're talking about a pluralistic theory. So think about monism as oneism and pluralism as manyism, right? Or more than oneism. Okay, so and then at least one intrinsic good is an objective good. Okay, and each intrinsic good is irreducibly fundamental. And what that means is that the things that we have on our list, objective list theory, nothing on the list is reducible to anything else. So think about how, like when we were talking about Epicurus, we talked about how he has a theory of prudence, but then he also has a theory of justice and courage, etc. He explains justice and courage and the other virtues in terms of prudence. So we have a kind of reducibility there. Of course, there we're talking about a theory of virtues. I'm trying to give you a sense of what it means to talk um, about something counting as irreducibly fundamental. It means it can't be reduced to something else. So when we think about um, objective list theories, we're talking about a set of things that count as intrinsically good, and nothing on the list is superior to anything else, or such that other things on the list would be explained in terms of it. Okay, so let me give you when I give you an example. Hopefully it'll make sense. So here's an example. You might imagine someone who's an objective list theorist saying what counts as intrinsically good are pleasure, happiness, virtue, autonomy, and friendship. Like these 5 things. Okay. This satisfies the objective list theory because we have more than one intrinsic good listed, and at least one of these intrinsically good things is objective. Presumably, virtue, autonomy, though at least those 2 things count as objectively good. And then each intrinsic good is irreducibly fundamental. When we look at the list here, we can't reduce happiness to pleasure or virtue to happiness or pleasure. We can't do, like, there's nothing on the list where we have one thing that's, by say, more important than the other in terms of explaining the others. Okay, so that's what's meant by this 3rd bullet point here. Okay, and these theories are called objective list theories because they include at least one objective good in them, and nothing non-trivially unifies a set of goods in the theory. So we have just a list. Okay, there's no principle or set of things that non-trivially explains why these things are on the list. And then another kind of a pluralistic view, at least traditionally, is perfectionism. Okay, so here we've got again, this is this traditionally identifies a plurality of goods. It doesn't have to, though. It could be monistic, but at least one common way of going pluralist in the literature nowadays is to go perfectionist. And according to perfection, one of the goods identified is objectively good, once again. So it has, with objective list theories, it has these first 2 points in common, and then the 3rd point here. But in contrast to the objective list theories, perfectionism maintains that the intrinsic goods are non-trivially unified. So there's something that unifies the things that belong to the list of things that count as intrinsically good. And what unifies them is that they contribute in an essential way to the perfection of human nature. So if this is our objective list theory, we could understand it as a perfectionist theory if we claim that the reason why pleasure, happiness, virtue, and autonomy, and friendship, the reason why they're all intrinsically good and contribute positively to people's lives is because they perfect human lives. Well, there you have the relevant unity that perfectionist theory has, that an objective list theory doesn't have. Okay. So that's just to give you a bit of the important taxonomy in thinking about value theory. Note that someone could be a perfectionist just by saying that virtue is what perfects us. So they could be like Socrates or something like that. Being perfect, being virtuous perfects human nature. And that way you could be a monist perfectionist. Okay. So that's, again, some important taxonomy. And keep in mind here, we're talking about theories of value, things that count as intrinsically good. But of course, there's the theory of what's intrinsically good for us, and that's going to be part of a value theory. So when one works out a value theory, they're going to want an account of things that count as intrinsically good, full stop, and an account of things that are intrinsically good for us. Now, those theories could perfectly overlap with each other, but they don't have to. Okay, so if you're a hedonist and you say what's intrinsically good is pleasure, and you're going to go on to that what's intrinsically good for us is pleasure. Okay, that's a very common move to make. So you can have this kind of perfect overlap, but you can imagine someone who's a hedonist about well-being, But they can go on to say that virtue is also intrinsically good, full stop. It's just not intrinsically good for us. Okay. It's only good for us. That is, say, virtue is only good for us in terms of our well-being, insofar as it produces pleasure. So it's perfectly consistent with being a hedonist about well-being, that one's a pluralist about value in general. So now some critical reflection, very briefly. So sometimes these critical reflections help students understand the theories that we're dealing with. So hedonism has a problem of bad pleasures. Some pleasures seem to be bad, okay? So when someone murders someone and gets pleasure out of it, that seems like that's bad, okay? Desire satisfactionism, the problem of bad or pointless desires. So we think that if someone has the desire to murder someone and that desire is satisfied because they murder that someone, well, that seems like that's bad too. But according to desire satisfaction theory, it's good. It's intrinsically good. Just like, when the person experiences pleasure when someone's murdered, the hedonist goes intrinsically good. Okay. Objective list theory, the problem of arbitrariness. You have a list of things that count as intrinsically good, but what's the theory that explains why they count as intrinsically good in the first place? Okay. So sometimes it's claimed that that theory ends up being too arbitrary. And then according to perfectionism, well, what does it mean for a human being to be perfect? And well, what is a human being, or what is human nature in the first place? And there's going to be some significant further theorizing that gets quite difficult quite quickly. Of course, there's responses to all these challenges, but these are at least initial challenges that a hedonist or desire satisfaction theorist, objective list theorists, or perfectionists would have to deal with in their theories. Okay, here's another famous challenge to hedonism, and this is going back to John Stuart Mill here. So John Stuart Mill runs this kind of argument, and the ancestor of this argument goes back to Aristotle. Keep in mind that John Stuart Mill was a hedonist who thought that this argument was worth challenging, and it's his response to this argument that allows John Stuart Mill to develop his personal version of hedonism. But here's a famous challenge to hedonism, the swine argument. If it were Aristotle's argument, it would be what the grazing animals argument, okay, not the pigs argument. So one, hedonism implies that the good for humans is on a par with what's good for pigs. Okay, here. So we're thinking here now about, like, well-being, okay, as that part of a value theory. Okay. So what's good, if hedonism is true, well, what's good for us is the same as what's good for pigs, because, well, it's pleasure in both cases. But step two in the argument is what's good for humans is better than what's good for pigs. And the classic claim, or the classic support here for it too, is going to be something like, well, moral virtue is also good for human beings. Like, human beings are somehow more dignified than pigs, such that what's good for us is more elevated than what's good for pigs. So then this would mean that hedonism is false, just in line with the idea that hedonism implies something that we consider to be false. Okay, so hedonism has this implication captured by one, but two captures the idea that the implication fails. Implication is false, or what hedonism implies is false, so that we can reject hedonism. Okay, so again, if this were Aristotle's argument, you know how it would run. Hedonism implies that what's good for humans is on par with what's good for grazing animals. There's pleasure in both cases, but what's good for humans is better than what's good for pigs. And the classic claim here is, well, human beings can aim at virtue. Okay, so the classic claim is lined up with Aristotle. But yeah, make sure I'm clear here. What's good for humans is better than what's good for grazing animals. That'd be the appropriate change. So we need to make the two to understand Aristotle's challenges we've talked about. So there's John Stuart Mill, 1806 1873. I've introduced him just a brief bit. He's a British philosopher writing in the 19th century. He's a hedonistic utilitarian, meaning that he thinks that when we think about how we should live our lives, what we do is we think about how we promote what's good for people. And he claims that what's good for people is pleasure. So he claims that when we act, we should act in such a way that we promote as much pleasure in the world as we can. So he's in that tradition, this utilitarian tradition, which maintains that that our most fundamental moral obligation is to promote the happiness of all. And then he defines happiness as a hedonist in terms of pleasure. So our fundamental obligation is to promote the pleasure of all. So if you wanted a slogan, here I go with slogans again. If you wanted a slogan for utilitarianism, it's promote the happiness of all. Okay, of all those who would be affected by your actions, including animals. Any being that's capable of sentience is what matters to philosophers like John Stuart Mill. Okay, and if you wanted a slogan for hedonistic utilitarianism, it's promote the pleasure of all. Okay, so hopefully those slogans help out because um, um, they're not going to be perfect, but they should give you something to hang your hat on as you try to think carefully about what these theories entail. So utilitarianism is a theory that tells us how we should live. Of course, we're focusing on value theory here. There's a connection between the two. So some philosophers like John Stuart Mill think that how do you figure out how you ought to live is determined by thinking about what's good for us. So you see the value theory and the normative theory are intimately related for someone like Mill. He says what's good for us is pleasure. So that tells us how we should live. We should live in such a way that we bring about that pleasure. So this was somewhat anticipated already in our thinking about Epicurus when he said, well, when we act, we should act for the sake of promoting pleasure in our lives. Okay, he didn't have in his mind, as many of the ancients didn't, this idea of universalizing happiness or pleasure. That doesn't come along until later in the tradition with figures like John Stuart Mill and his predecessor in the tradition, Jeremy Bentham, okay, who was John Stuart Mill's father's good friend. So John Stuart Mill's father was James Mill. He was friends with Bentham, and then Mill thought to correct Bentham's and his father's versions of hedonism and hedonistic utilitarianism, as it turns out. He's in the empiricist tradition like Epicurus was, but much later in the tradition. So there's the British empiricist tradition. Knowledge derives from sense experience, okay, fundamentally. Human reason then operates on the ideas that we get from our sense experiences. In terms of his metaphysics, he's a naturalist. The natural sciences will tell us what exists, not sort of armchair abstract thinking about things. Okay. Okay, so that just kind of rounds out John Stuart Mill's worldview. Just like say a few more things about him. I'm not just mentioning him. Okay, good. So here's Mill's infamous response. It's infamous because it's problematic. So Mill's trying to respond to the swine argument in a way that you might say elevates some kinds of pleasures over others. So that way he can say with philosophers like Aristotle that what's good for humans is better than what's good for grazing animals or pigs or animals more generally. So some pleasures are just intrinsically better than others on his view. Some are superior, intrinsically superior, as he sometimes puts it, qualitatively superior, meaning intrinsically better than others. He claims there are higher and lower pleasures. Okay, so then that would allow him to say that what's good for humans is better than what's good for pigs or grazing animals, because what's good for humans, in addition to the lower pleasures, are also the higher pleasures. Now, let me just want to check something real quick. Good. Just want to make sure we're clear here. The higher pleasures correspond to rational pleasures, it turns out. So he wants to emphasize human rationality is what kind of creates a kind of dignity over animals. So here he emphasizes things like intellectual pleasures, the pleasures you might get from reading, doing crosswords, mathematics, etc. So intellectual moral pleasures, the pleasures we get from doing good for others, and aesthetic pleasures, the pleasures we get from enjoying art, for example. And then the lower pleasures correspond to bodily or sensual pleasures. Okay, and I think the proper understanding of Mill has it that even though we can conceptually distinguish the higher and lower pleasures from each other, For us, they're generally inextricably linked, meaning that our bodily pleasures often have higher pleasures associated with them. Okay, we can discuss that more if you're interested, but that's at least initial way of capturing this higher versus lower pleasure distinction. Again, say that that some pleasures are intrinsically better. The higher pleasures, more exactly, are intrinsically better or qualitatively better than the lower ones, means that, at least the way Mill describes it, any amount of the higher pleasures outweigh any amount of the lower pleasures. So you could have like 5 units of pleasure that's higher, that's going to be more valuable than, you know, 1,000,000 units of some purely bodily pleasure. Okay, supposing that's possible. It needn't be possible, but you could just, in the abstract, think about how there are just some entities, some beings that experience only the lower pleasures, i.e. animals, crazy animals, pigs, okay? Any amount of the higher outweigh any amount of the lower. So think about what that commits a Mill to here. So the problem with this response is, even though it might be true that there are higher and lower pleasures, it's just that Mill can't say that and remain a hedonist. Okay, if some higher pleasures are intrinsically better than lower pleasures, then something besides pleasures has to explain this. So this attempt to save hedonism ends up resulting in its refutation if it's right. Why? Because hedonism is a monistic theory. And if you have these two different kinds of pleasure, and something besides pleasure has to explain their qualitative difference, then presumably there has to be something else that's intrinsically good to do that. And that'd be some other thing. So we have a pluralistic theory. So hedonism entails monism, but Mill's higher lower pleasure distinction implies pluralism. So his higher versus lower pleasure distinction entails that he's not a hedonist. Okay, so he's trying to preserve hedonism, but the higher lower pleasure distinction refutes hedonism if it's right. Okay, so it might well be that there's this distinction again, but it would mean that hedonism is false. Okay, and the way I put it here is because so the reason why the attempt to save hedonism results in its refutation is because the higher lower pleasure distinction implies value pluralism, and hedonism necessarily a version of value monism, as we call it. Okay, and here you can be thinking about how the relevant value monism is well-being monism. Okay, so we're focusing on that here. And here, this is just that well-being stuff, just so we're clear. In case seeing a slide helps out with understanding what's going on here. A complete value theory, right? A theory of what's intrinsically good is going to provide a theory of well-being. That is, it provides a theory of what's intrinsically good for us. So a value theory is going to have this, a theory of good for us, and a theory of what's good, full stop. And remember, the relevant goodness is intrinsic goodness. Okay. The intrinsically good things explain goodness in general. Okay, so that's why we can just say good for us, good full stop. So it wouldn't be goodness without the intrinsic goods, at least according to substandard arguments for the claim that there are intrinsically good things in the first place. Okay, I've already noted this, but just so you have a slide to see how to unpack the idea a little bit. So one can be hedonist about well-being while being a pluralist about value. Okay, and hedonist about value, full stop, are also hedonist about well-being. So as I said before, remember you can have someone who's a well-being hedonist. So when it comes to what's good for us, that's pleasure on their view. They could be an objective listers because they can say, look, virtue is also intrinsically good. Okay, so I happen to know such a philosopher. His name's Ben Bradley. He's a hedonist about well-being, but he at least at times has said that, oh, I also think that justice is intrinsically good, but it's not intrinsically good for us. Justice is good for us when it brings about pleasure. Okay. Now let's go back to Nozick. So we began this discussion with Nozick's thought experiment, his experience machine thought experiment, and then I thought I would go through and discuss value theory and a theory of well-being give you a bit of a taxonomy of the various positions, so you have a better sense of like, what's at stake. I feel like if you understand a bit more of like the landscape that Nozick is working in, you understand his argument a bit better. Okay, and so one classic argument against hedonism is the swine argument, which traces, remember, back to Aristotle's raising animals argument, as we could call it. But then we get this new argument against hedonism developed by Nozick. Okay, so it's the experience machine argument, which relies on the experience machine thought experiment. So have that in mind here. And again, we're applying this to well-being hedonism. Okay, so one, if hedonism is true, then it's best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. Why? Because we could be sure that we get pleasant experiences that way. Okay, so what's best for us, according to hedonists, is to have pleasant experiences. So if hedonism is true, then it's best for us in terms of well-being to hook up to the machine. Okay, but two, it isn't best in terms of well-being to hook up to the experience machine. Okay, so when Nozick, when he asks the question, would you hook up or would you want to hook up? He claims that most tend to have an aversion to doing so. And that's kind of an intuition pump, as sometimes it's called in the literature. It's pumping our intuitions for what we think is true intuitively. And then we provide the relevant philosophical support for what we intuitively believe. Okay? So we tend to think it's not best for us to hook up to the experience machine. That something would be missing in terms of well-being if we were to hook up to such a machine for long periods of time, 2 to 5 years, or the rest of our lives. Okay? So then, given that hedonism implies something false, implies something that's not best for us, implies that we should do something that's not best for us, well then, hedonism itself must fail. Okay, and here I'm just providing the argument 1 to 2 to 3. The logical move from 1 to 2 to 3 is what we call modus tollens. So if you wanted to look that up, that's the logic. As the course goes on, I might stop and do some logic work, but you can trust me on that. If you don't trust me on that, come to office hours, send me an email, I'll explain modus tollens to you. An inference rule, that means that our move from 1 to 2 to 3 is perfectly logically fine. We call it valid in logic. So if there's a problem with the argument, it's not the logic of the move from 1 to 2 to 3, it'd be something else. Okay, the truth of one of the premises might be the issue. Okay, but still, we're just trying to understand the argument here. Okay, so remember, why is one true? One's true, according to Nozick, because, well, we'd be able to ensure pleasant experiences, even though those experiences would be what? Virtual or veridical. So if you don't know, pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Even if they're, if you're in an experience machine, of course, they're virtual, right? So the hedonist isn't in a position to say that the veridical ones are better than the virtual ones, because they'd be, as it were, in a way, making Mill's mistake, wouldn't they? To say that one kind of pleasure is better than another. So the kind of pleasure in question doesn't matter. Okay. But it does seem to matter for our well-being that we have some kind of connection to the world, that we're not just living in a simulation. Like, we tend to think, don't we, that that it'd be worse for us if we lived in a simulation than if we had contact with reality, with people in reality, etc. Okay. So premise 1, I've already kind of captured. The experience machine will guarantee pleasant experiences. Boom. Premise 2, support for it, I've already kind of captured in intuitive form. But here are the lines of reasoning that Nozick offers. One, under premise 2 here, it's better to really do things, better to develop one's character, and to engage with a transcendent reality that it is to enjoy simulated experiences in the experience machine. Like, so even if we were to get less pleasure, I think Nozick would say, overall, it's still better for us to really do something, to develop our characters and to engage with transcendent reality. Okay, let me see if I can explain those a little bit more. So it's better to really do things. Argument or support for that. You can imagine having you can imagine having entered the experience machine and setting up that you're going to do this um, uh, uh, this climbing of Everest, or pick your favorite peak you'd like to climb to, or climb up. You can imagine that being simulated, purely simulated. But you can also imagine actually doing it. And what Nozick seems to want to say here is, all things being equal, it's better to really climb Everest than it is uh, not, than to only virtually do so. Okay. There's something intuitive about that. Okay. Second point, it's better to develop one's character than it is to be part of a mere simulation. So the thought here, I think, is supposed to be that in order to develop your character, you have to have some kind of contact with a world that resists you. And that world is outside of you. It transcends you in a certain way. So your relationships with your family, your friends, with obstacles in the world around you, these are the kinds of things that are required to develop one's character. But of course, if you're just passively having virtual experiences in a simulation, then you really aren't developing your character. You can't develop your character. He says you become kind of like an indeterminate blob in the experience machine. And so when you go on vacation for the 2 to 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in the experience machine, you're not going to come out a more developed person. Okay, and it's better for our well-being for our characters to develop. And then third, you might think that this second point is really tied up with virtue. But I think the first point is as well, because it requires, you know, the the pain and suffering and the resistance of Everest to when you really do it, compared to it just feeling like you are, but you're really not. And this last point, to engage with transcendent reality. Well, transcendent here means transcending the man-made, and then it is to enjoy simulated experiences or purely virtual experiences in the experience machine. So what is Nozick's point here? Well, it's think about transcendent reality. Well, there seems like there's a reality that transcends the human, right? The natural world, for one. The Everest example fits in nicely here. So to engage with a world that goes beyond the human-made, even the supercomputer that produces the smorgasbord of experiences in the experience machine, that's still human-made, let's say. So to engage with nature, the natural world, and even to engage with God or a supernatural reality that exists or that one believes in. So Nozick is agnostic about whether there's a God, but um, if there is a God and one is correct in their relationship, in their beliefs about there being a God, then one would miss out on that transcendent reality if one were to go into a purely virtual simulated kind of existence. Okay. So if you go into the experience machine for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, etc., those are years you have just pure simulated experiences, veridical. You wouldn't have any contact with God or the supernatural, etc. You wouldn't also have contact with the natural world, for going on hikes, watching sunsets, um, going to the beach, playing sports outside, um, uh, enjoying a picnic under a tall tree that casts a broad shadow for enjoyment, etc. Okay. So it's important to know here that Nozick's not claiming that we can get better or more pleasure in reality compared to what we can get in the experience machine. So I've already made this point, but I just want to make it again. He's claiming that even if we assume that the experience machine and reality offer the same with respect to pleasure, it's still better for us to really do things, to really self-improve, and to interact with human transcending things like nature and or the supernatural. Okay. So it's not that we get more pleasure in reality. He doesn't have to assume that at all. We suppose that that's not true. It still derive the same conclusion. Okay, he's not trying to say that some pleasures are intrinsically better than others, so he's not making Mill's mistake. Nozick would have known that mistake, and he wouldn't make it. Okay, if Nozick were to be arguing that there are qualitatively better pleasures in reality than in the experience machine, then he would be invoking something akin to the higher-lower pleasure distinction, which was designed to defend hedonism, though it failed, of course. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover from the Nozick. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. And I wish you all well. If you have any questions about what I've discussed in the Nozick, you're reading the Nozick, you have any questions about any of the passages, reach out, let me know. I'm happy to help. Thank you for watching and have a great one.